Hello and welcome back to the Cambrian Virtual Show, the show that we're running between the 22nd of May and the 29th of May to catch up with all our previous speakers and also the upcoming speakers that we've got coming up. You can go to our website, which is www.cambrianphoto.co.uk, or you can follow the link in the description. On our website, you'll be able to see all the previous rewatch recordings that we've done, so you're able to rewatch any of the courses that have been, and also you can schedule the lives to see what's coming up as well. I will also put a link in the comments, but there's also a link in the description as well. We are very happy to announce that all of our speakers, all of our talks are free as well. So a big thank you to all the speakers that have come in to help out with the Cambrian show. Because of this, we are asking for donations. And once again, you can find the donations button on our virtual show website as well. So please, if you can, hit the donate button and all the profits will go to chosen charities and our local food banks as well. So having a nice couple of good mornings, looking forward to this one as well. So that's absolutely brilliant. Yes, it's my honour to announce our guest for today, Jill. So let's give a big warm welcome to Jill. Hi, Jill.
Hi.
How are you today?
Yeah, just about.
Yes, we were just talking off camera as well. How it's a little bit strange doing a talk with just to your computer screen, isn't it?
Certainly is. Yeah. I talk to myself all the time, but nobody ever answers, so I should be used to it, really.
Oh, there we go. At least this way, we're getting sort of answers and comments on the side. So
yeah, very good.
It's kind of like normal, but we can see what's going on there. Yeah. A lot of interest we've had around today as well. So because in one way it is photography related, but in other ways it isn't, because it doesn't involve a camera almost, does it? So it's slightly different from what we're normally used to, but does have a sort of fundamental sort of photography background, which is very interesting. So yes, and it's about cyanotypes. Which is your thing, isn't it?
It certainly is, yeah. Yeah, I do own a camera and I do sometimes take pictures with a camera, but since I discovered cyanotypes, that's been my main thing. So yeah, it's interesting and different, and hopefully it'll encourage a few people to try it. And it does make you think in a different way and look at things differently. So it's definitely worth a go.
Yeah. I mean, it's once again, it's finding what you love to do, isn't it? More than anything. So whether it be photography or generating cyanotypes, it's you do the things that make you happy, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely, definitely, yeah. And it is addictive as well. So once you start, you might find that you can't stop as well.
Oh, that's brilliant. So yeah, you've sort of prepared a little presentation for us today. So we have also said, obviously, if anyone's got any questions throughout this, just drop them in the comments and we'll try and get to them at the end. So yes, I'll just sort of pull your screen up there, Jill, so you'll be able to see that there, and I'll let you carry on. Thank you very much, Jill.
Okay, thank you. Well, hello everybody, and thank you for coming to listen to me today. As I say, it's very unusual talking to a computer screen, but we'll see how it goes. So I'll talk a little bit to start off with about the cyanotype process itself, which was invented in 1842 by Sir John Herschel. And basically, two chemicals, ferric ammonium citrate and potassium ferricyanide, come in a powdered form, which you can see in the top left picture here, a green chemical and an orange chemical. When those two are mixed with water and then mixed together, they become sensitive to UV light, and therefore that's how the photographic image is created. So I mix the chemicals together at the time when I want to use them, and I use either a brush or a sponge brush to apply the chemicals to the piece of paper. I tend to specialise in botanical images. I have to stress at this point that I am not a gardener. I have no knowledge of horticulture, botany or anything. I just love to see plants and enjoy being out in nature. And I'm very lucky. I've got a very good friend who's an excellent gardener, and she provides me with lots of samples. But I also collect things when I'm out and about on my daily dog walks, from the hedgerows, ferns and wild plants. I mean, here we've got a selection of ferns, vetch, cranesbill leaves, things that are going to make interesting images on the paper when they've been exposed. There's a delightful image of me here with the prepared cyanotypes with the plants laid on top outside, in the sun, exposing the images, and then the image on the right is the end result. Basically, the process was first used, as I say, in 1842 it was invented, and in 1843 a lady called Anna Atkins created what's been called the first book illustrated with photographic images using the cyanotype process. And her book, Cyanotypes of British Algae, is still available to view. It's held in public collections around the world. There are 13 known copies of the book in existence, and you can go to the Public Library in New York, for example, and the V&A in London have examples of her books and her cyanotype prints for you to view, and they're definitely worth a look. There's also a very good book called Some Gardens, the Cyanotypes of Anna Atkins, which you can buy, and it's got some facsimile copies of her images in there. And they were kind of an inspiration to me to start trying this process and creating these images. So we'll move on and talk a little bit about the exposure of the image. So as I said, you coat the paper with the cyanotype chemicals and leave it to dry. You can do this in a dim room. It doesn't have to be a photographic dark room. But when you leave them to dry, you've got to leave them in the dark. I tend to coat my paper in the evenings and then put it in the airing cupboard or an old cupboard that I've got, and leave it to dry overnight so that it's ready for use the next morning. So subsequently, I'm always watching the weather forecast to see whether it's going to be sunny or not the next day. Excuse me. Once the paper's dry, you need to store it in the dark, and I store it in a lightproof bag in an old wardrobe. So when you come to use it, it's very simple. It's one of the simplest processes you can use. Just pick up your plant. You can press them beforehand, and if you do press them beforehand for a week or so, then they will be nice and flat, and it makes it a lot easier to keep the object close to the paper. It is a contact printing process, so you do have to have the object as close to the paper as possible to get the crispest and best results. But having said that, I'm not very patient, so quite often I'll just use things as I pick them. Sometimes it's quite interesting as well to use plants that haven't been pressed, because you can get some interesting shadows. So if it's not too windy and you've got a lovely branch or something, you can lay that just on top of the paper without pressing it down, and you get some interesting shadow effects with some lighter areas of blue as well as the usual dark blue background. But as a general rule, I do clamp my plants down to the paper. I use old picture frames. I have the backboard from the frame and the glass, and I press them together between those two things with bulldog clips, and then put them outside in the sun. You can use a UV lamp to do this, but I tend to try and use the sun wherever possible, and save the planet and don't use the electric, and it's keeping you that contact in nature. And it's nice to be outside, and you can actually see the process taking place before your eyes. It's a bit magical. The colour of the paper when you first start is like a chartreuse green shot sort of colour. And when you put it outside in the sun, you can see it starts to change through shades of greens and blues to this eventually ends up being this sort of pale grey colour. And that's when you can tell that the exposure is complete. So in this example here, you can see that it's been exposed. I've removed the leaves a little bit so you can see underneath, and you can see these interesting sort of shades of blue and green. It looks nothing like the end result. So the next process is to rinse it in water. This is just another example of a pre-exposed print. Sometimes the pre-exposed prints actually look nicer than the end result. You get more interest because you've got varying shades and tones. But unfortunately, usually as soon as you rinse it, you end up with a blue and white image. So as you put your piece of paper into the water, you can see it start to change colour almost straight away, and the blue starts to get stronger as you rinse it. I do my rinsing in a photographic tray. I just put some water in the tray and gently agitate it till the unexposed chemicals are rinsed off. And then once it's completely rinsed off, leave it to dry. It takes about 24 hours for the final colour to come through. You can speed things up by adding hydrogen peroxide. Some people say it changes the end result, but I've never really noticed it, so I tend not to use it just because I don't really want to add other chemicals in at that stage. If you're patient and wait for about 24 hours, you'll see this lovely Prussian blue colour coming through. It is possible to purchase pre-coated paper. So if it's something that you just want to experiment with, but you don't necessarily want to start messing with chemicals, you can buy packs of pre-coated paper and you're ready just to get started with your bits of plants or whatever you want to use. And you can also buy small kits. So if you just want to have a go at mixing the chemicals up, you can buy a kit with just small quantities of the chemicals. They usually have paper in them and the coating brush and something like that. So again, it's an opportunity to just experiment and give it a go. It's easily accessible, it's not expensive, and it's a magical process that it's good to do with children as well. Obviously, when you're messing with the chemicals, always wear gloves. So you don't want these things coming into contact with your hands. But apart from that, it's a relatively safe sort of photographic process. You're not in a dark room with lots of toxic and smelly chemicals. So just a couple of examples here of some of the cyanotype prints that I've made. I tend to look for things with interesting outlines. So things like ferns, there are a lot, I mean, the fern family, there are thousands of them. And they do seem to have the most interesting silhouettes, because at the end of the day, what you end up with is a silhouette of the object that you put on the paper. Exposure times here in North Yorkshire vary from 5 minutes on a really hot sunny day through to maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, depending on the time of year. A lot of people only do cyanotypes in the summer, but I do try to do them all year round. You run out a little bit of botanical supplies in the winter, but there's always something that you can buy from the florists, and there's usually something that's still lurking in the garden or the hedgerow that will make an interesting print. So say things that work well are things like ferns. This example is a skeleton magnolia leaf, which a friend of mine gave me, and they make really interesting prints as well. So they're good things to look out for. You sometimes find skeletonized leaves in the hedgerows or under trees, and you can make them yourself as well if you want to, by boiling the leaves in water with I've forgotten what it is now. So soda crystals, washing soda crystals. So usually you end up with a blue and white silhouette, but if you leave the leaves out to expose for longer, sometimes you can end up getting all the details of the leaves coming through, all the veining in the leaves. This one was left out. If I remember rightly, I did this one quite a long time ago, but this one was actually exposed for about 6 hours. But the problem is they don't always work. Not all leaves will react in this way. So if they're very dense, then the sun can't get through them. and there's no easy way to tell whether it's actually worked or not. This really was pure luck. I've had a few other successes doing it this way, but you can't, sometimes you can leave it out for days and still take the leaf off and find that it's just a blue and white silhouette at the end. So it is really just the look of the draw with that one. But I was really pleased with the way that one turned out. In this case, I mean, as I said earlier, I tend to use old picture frames. So you've got to completely remove the glass and lift the leaf up to be able to see whether it is done as exposed for as much as it needs to be. But if you have access to old contact printing frames, they are ideal because you don't have to lift the glass off. You can just open the back up and lift a little bit of the leaf up to see whether it's actually worked or not. But they are quite expensive to buy. You can make your own, but I haven't actually got around to that process yet. Something else that I experimented with early on was multiple exposures. So you can move the leaves around. So if you put your leaves on the piece of paper and put them outside to expose, and then bring them in, move the leaves around, add different leaves, take leaves away, and put it back out to expose again. And you can repeat that process 2 or 3 times. You can end up with more interesting images where you get tones of blue rather than just blue and white silhouettes. So this is an example I did with lots of different wildflowers that I found in the hedgerows. And I think there are about 3 or 4 exposures in this one. So put some plants on, stick it outside for a couple of minutes, bring it in, take them off, back outside for a couple of minutes, and just keep doing that. It's hard to judge because everything's sort of a little bit blurred on the page, and sometimes some of them disappear completely, but then when you put it in the water and rinse it off, the tones start to appear, and that is really quite a lovely process to use. And you can get some quite dynamic and interesting images using the Cyanotype process in that way. And that's just another example where I used a stencil. So it's basically just a piece of cardboard, a couple of pieces of cardboard cut out into circle shapes, interleaved with Corydalis leaves, and just exposed a number of times on the same day, once after another, just moving things around on the page as I went, and again creating an interesting sort of image. So this is another example of some ash leaves where the exposure was quite long, so you can see some of the detail in the veins, but as you can see, they didn't all expose for all that they were out for the same length of time. I just left it outside for a couple of hours. You can see that the ones on the left are much paler than the others, and there's not so much detail in the veins. So you can pick up leaves off the same tree, and you won't necessarily get the same reaction over the same length of exposure time. This one I felt was a little bit, because of that variation in tone, it didn't work quite so well, so I actually toned this one with green tea. This one was toned with, and that just changes the colour. I'll talk a little bit about toning over the next few slides. There are a number of different things that you can use that you've got in your house, but they do add a little bit more to a plain cyanotype image as well, so something else that's worth experimenting with. As well as using actual botanical specimens, you can use photographic negatives to create cyanotypes as well. I don't do a lot of this. I tried it early on, and it's exactly the same process. Printing the negative of the image out onto acetate, flipping the image because you put the acetate face down on the paper so that it's the right way around on the paper, and exposing it outside. You can do a test strip to see how long your exposures need to be. In actual fact, with negatives, it's probably better to use a UV lamp because you can be more precise about your timings. So if you do a test strip, put a piece of card on a piece of treated paper and just move it up the paper every 2 minutes, will give you the different tones of blue that you can achieve. and tell you what your length of exposure time is, so that you can get the right exposure for your negative. So I've done a few of these, and again, I've tried toning. So again, this one is toned with green tea. I think that's my favourite because it does give this lovely sort of purpley brown colour, and it's quite soft as well, so you still get a lot of detail in the highlights. Quite often when you tone cyanotype images, you lose some of the highlight details, and it doesn't, to me, isn't as nice as the green tea. But you can use other things. I've used builder's tea. It's really strong, PG tips or whatever, and coffee makes another nice one as well. With toning, there's a couple of ways of doing it. You can either bleach the image, so you expose the image, rinse it, leave it to dry, and then you can bleach it to lighten it, and then soak it in a tray with tea or coffee, whatever you're using. You don't have to bleach it beforehand, but if you don't, then the image will become much darker, and you can get much darker blues. So this one was bleached for a little while and then toned. This is just another example. This is actually on different paper, and that's another thing that I've not actually spoken about yet, is the type of paper that you use. I mean, when you first get started, you can use any paper as long as it will stand up to being rinsed in water. So you can start off with really cheap watercolour paper, is a good one to start with. Textured papers you get more detail of the texture on the image, and it can soften the image as well. This is actually on a Hanamola watercolour paper, Aquarelle, which has got quite a smooth surface, but it's got a little bit of tooth to it, so you can see how it's really softened the image. But this one was toned in tea as well. It's quite a nice soft sort of, it looks like an old photograph. Just another example of a negative, which was then toned with green tea again. It does, if you sort of flick between the two, it does add something else to the image, and it just makes it look a little bit different, more like a sepia photograph. And so you can get some quite nice effects. This one has been toned with coffee. And again, I quite like the coffee. It's not as warm toned as the previous tea toned images, but it does give you quite a nice effect, and it keeps some of the lights in the highlights as well. It doesn't lose the highlights too much, so you still get nice contrast. Right. More experimentation. This was another thing that I tried early on, was cutting out stencils and using negatives behind the stencils to create different images. So I called this one Tyree Turn because the photograph is actually the beach on the island of Tyree, and we saw terns while we were there. So I cut the stencil of the turn out and overlaid it with the negative underneath, and just put it out as one exposure, and created this quite interesting sort of effect. So that's an example of a stencil of a butterfly that I cut out, and that's how the image ends up, with a photographic negative underneath it. So you get the outline of the butterfly beautifully crisp with just the leaves behind it. I quite like the effect. I've not done this for a while, so I might have to do some more of that. And alternatively, you can use the bit that you've cut out to create an image as well. So that was laid on the paper. The stencil of the butterfly was laid on the paper, and it was put outside to expose for a few minutes. So when I brought it in, all that was there was the white silhouette of the butterfly, and then I put the photographic negative on top and put it back outside again to expose, and got this lovely overlaid image, which works really well. So another interesting technique to experiment with. And these are just some more examples of stencils where I've actually used the wet cyanotype technique to create these images of butterflies. And again, something different to try that worked out quite well. Mainly my images are botanical and animals, birds and butterflies and things like that, but every now and again I get the urge to try something a bit more abstract. This was basically just a circle cut out of a piece of card and exposed with the circle on the card, so I got the blue background with a white circle in the middle. And then I added soap suds and vinegar and put it back outside and exposed again. It created this lovely image, and it made me think of the moon or planets or something like that. So I went through a whole process of phases of the moon. So there's a couple of them to you see what I mean. But again, you can create some quite interesting abstract images. You know, the beauty of the cyanotype technique, it's so experimental and there's so many different things that you can try with it. You could keep going forever. There's so much that I haven't tried yet that I still need to do. So I also experimented a little bit with the wet cyanotype process with photographic negatives, but I've had absolutely no success with this. I mean, this image is not too bad. It's quite interesting, but the problem was that because you put the negative upside down, the ink from the acetate actually leaks and it blurs the picture. So I've not been able to get anything that I've been overly happy with, but that's just one example. If you are interested in finding out more about wet cyanotypes with photographic negatives, then I would highly recommend looking up a lady called Krista McCurdy, who has a tutorial on her website of how to make wet cyanotypes with photographic negatives, so it's definitely worth a watch. And also, I mean, you can use the same technique for creating wet cyanotypes with botanical specimens as well. So yeah, it's worth having a look at her website. I can put something on the comments later if people are interested in that. So a lot of you will know that I won the International Garden Photographer of the Year in February last year with this image of alliums from my garden, which I called fireworks. They just reminded me of fireworks exploding off the top of the page. And most people who know my work know my wet cyanotype work more than anything else. And so basically the difference between what I've just been showing you with the traditional cyanotypes, rather than using the paper dry, you use it when it's wet. You can either use it so you paint your chemicals on, and while those chemicals are still wet on the page, start putting your prints and things, your leaves and things on top, and then expose it that way. I still tend to leave my paper to dry overnight, but then add the extra liquids on top just before the exposure. So I'm using things like soap suds and diluted vinegar, which is exactly what was on this particular image, to create the end results. So I'll talk you a little bit about the wet cyanotype process, because I do get asked an awful lot how I create these sort of textures and these images. So basically you start with your plant, as same as with any of my other cyanotypes. To create the bubbles, I have a tray. This is just an old under the bed storage tray from IKEA or somewhere, with water in it out of the tap and really cheap basic washing up liquid, not antibacterial washing up liquid, just Sainsbury's own cheap and cheerful basic washing up liquid's what's in there. Big squirt of washing up liquid in the tray with some water, and give the tray a really, really good shake to build the bubbles up on the surface. And then I'll lay the treated cyanotype paper face down onto the bubbles, and the bubbles stick to the paper. And when you turn them over, you've got bubbles stuck onto your paper. They won't stick all over, they might just stick in certain places. I sometimes push the paper down a little bit to pick a few more bubbles up, and sometimes I use a spoon to add more bubbles onto the paper if I think it's not got enough. But that's all I do. I then use a plant spray, and there's diluted vinegar in the plant spray. So I use diluted distilled white vinegar. Lots of people ask me what the ratio is of vinegar to water. I really don't know. I'm not scientific at all. It's different every time I mix it. So I just a dollop of vinegar into the spray bottle with some cold water out of the tap, and give it a good shake, and then just spray it on top of the paper and add the plants. In this case, the shamrock leaves. Piece of glass on the top that's clamped down with bulldog clips, and then that goes out in the sunshine. The difference with the wet cyanotype process is you can leave them out for a lot longer. So my exposures can be anything from an hour up to several days. As I said before, I do cyanotypes right through the year. And in the winter, when the sun isn't very high in the sky and the UV light's not very strong, I might leave them out for 3 days. It just depends what it's been like over the time while I've been exposing them. So there's no real way to gauge how long when it's ready. You just sort of see what it looks like and think, well, it might be okay, and bring it in and give it a rinse. So this is what it looks like before it's actually been rinsed. Sometimes the pre-rinsed image is actually much better than the end result. You get a lot of different colours. The colours are sometimes a lot stronger when you first bring them in. Some people photograph them, scan them, and that's the finished artwork. I do like some of them more than others, but they're not the same as a real original cyanotype, so I do always rinse them as well. And that's the difference. So you go from that before it's rinsed to that after it's rinsed and dried, and the colours change. So you put it in the water, the colours change in the water, but then they change over the next 24 hours as well. And sometimes over the next week, the colours are still changing a little bit. They usually do revert back to blues and greens mostly, but depending on what else you've done to it, you can sometimes get rust colours coming through, which can make some really interesting effects as well. So this is just another example of one. So this is just before it went out in the sun. This is actually what it looked like after it had been out in the sun for about half an hour. The colours go through a series of changes, and again, it's quite interesting to watch, but you don't want to be stood out there for hours watching the whole thing. And then that's the end, and the end result after it's been rinsed. And that's just another example of some bluebells that I've done quite recently from a friend's garden. And you can get some interesting, you can see how the sort of shapes swirl around the curve of the bluebell, and the soap suds tend to sort of channel themselves round. When you put the piece of glass on top, they channel themselves round whatever you've got on the page, especially if it's a bit three-dimensional, and you can create some lovely movement through the images as well, which creates interesting effects. But I have to stress, you have absolutely no control over it. The bubbles go where the bubbles go, and there's nothing you can do about it. So you just end up with what you get. And just another example of a pre-rinse image with some of the more interesting colours on it. And then that's after the rinse, when it's gone. After it's been dried for a couple of days, and it's gone back to the more blue tones, but you still get those lovely textures in the background, which is what I really like as part of this process. I did take a couple of photographs of an exposure as it was going along. It's always a little bit worrying when you first put one of these, especially with the soap suds, because first of all, it starts to go these lovely shades of blue, and then all of a sudden it starts to fade, and you almost have a white sheet of paper, and you think, oh my goodness, it's just going to disappear. There's going to be nothing on this page. And then you just leave it out, and it's slowly the colours start to come back and build up, and then can build up to some really, really strong colours. So it's quite interesting to sort of see that process over a period of time. And again, just some more images of a pre-rinse, what it looked like before when I first brought it in, and then what it looked like afterwards when it had been rinsed and dried. And that's quite a dramatic change, because you've got those lovely sort of warm orangey colours and you think, oh yeah, that's great, I wish they were going to stay there, and then they disappear. But never mind, that's all part of the fun of the process. I do like to experiment with all sorts of different techniques, as you probably gathered. And this one is a mixture of cut-out stencils, maple leaves, and it's a multiple exposure. So first of all, I just put the circles and the leaves onto the page and put it outside to expose. So that would have just been a blue and white traditional cyanotype image. But then I added the soap suds and the vinegar and the glass and put it back outside again for a few hours, and ended up with this result. Now this is before it was rinsed, and this is what it looked like afterwards. So it's, again, just something to experiment with and try different things, and create some interesting results. But I do use other things as well as soap suds and vinegar. So in this example, I actually used instant coffee granules dissolved in hot water, quite strong mix. And I applied that to the paper just before the exposure, along with some soap suds and some vinegar. And as I said earlier, you can see how the liquid is sort of channeled its way around the page between the ginkgo leaves in this case, and created this sort of effect of, to me, it looks like ginkgo leaves floating down a stream. I was really happy with that one. I really like that effect. If you do want to add some other colours into your wet cyanotypes, you can add different things. So this one's actually got baking soda added into it. So with the baking soda, what I tend to do is mix some of the powder in with some water, and then just sprinkle it over, or spray it over the paper just before the exposure. But basically, cyanotypes like acid, and baking soda is an alkali. So the alkali removes some of the blue from the image and creates these sort of rusty colours. And again, it's something else that you can experiment with, different strengths. I wouldn't use it too strong, because you can end up with a completely bleached image if you do. But by adding just a little bit into it, you can create some interesting effects. This one was a winter one. This is actually done with ice and cling film. So what I did here was, overnight, I put a sheet of cling film on a baking tray with a small amount of water and some maple leaves on top, and put it in the freezer overnight. And when I took it out the next morning and just lifted the cling film out and placed it face down so that the ice and the leaves were against the paper, and put it outside underneath a piece of glass and left it to expose for the whole day. And it created this really interesting sort of effect. You can use cling film quite well, and it creates some interesting textures in the backgrounds of your cyanotypes. So again, something else that you can experiment with. And this was more ice experimentation. This time I didn't use the cling film, I just had water and a fern leaf. But when I took it out, the ice all cracked up. When I took it out of the freezer, the ice all cracked up. So I just placed bits of ice and the frozen fern on top of the paper. I tried to put a piece of glass on top as well, but it was a bit the ice was too thick. And just left that out for the day, and got these effects here. This is another one where I've thrown everything but the kitchen sink at it. It's got soap suds, vinegar, coffee, and turmeric to give those yellow tones in the leaves. Turmeric, I mix it with water. It doesn't really mix very well, but some of the colour does come out of it, and you can create some interesting mixes of colour on the paper. I have been told that the turmeric may fade over time, so it is possible that over time the yellow tones may disappear completely if it's exposed to the sun. And I always say with cyanotypes, if you are hanging them on a wall, do hang them out of direct sunlight, frame them in a frame with a mount, so that they've got a bit of air, because cyanotype likes the oxygen. And keep them out of direct sunlight. You can use UV, non-UV glass so that it stops some of the UV rays from getting through. But this, as I said, this one may possibly change over time. And washing soda crystals, I did mention earlier, you can use washing soda crystals to bleach your cyanotypes before you tone them. But in this instance, I actually threw a few washing soda crystals on top of the paper, along with some diluted vinegar and a few splashes of water. You do have to be careful with the washing soda crystals because, as I say, it can bleach the image, and you can see there part of it's almost been lost. But it does, again, create some different colours and textures that you can experiment with. But I'd be a bit sparing with the crystals. And again, another multiple exposure wet cyanotype combination. So with this one, I basically just laid the leaves onto the paper and exposed it as a traditional cyanotype with a blue and white silhouette. But rather than then just rinsing it, I added some soap suds and diluted vinegar and put it outside again to expose for a few hours, and created more background tones and textures rather than just the plain dark Prussian blue background that you would normally get, and some interesting tones and shades that sort of add a bit of three-dimensionality to the plant silhouettes as well, to make it a bit more interesting. I mentioned about using cling film earlier, and this was one that I did in my earlier wet cyanotype experiments. So this was just, I think there was vinegar and baking powder on this one, and scrunched up cling film just placed on top of the tulips before the exposure. And you can see the lines have been created where the liquid sort of channeled up the creases of the cling film, creating this sort of otherworldly effect, I think, in that instance. And again, another multiple exposure mixed with the wet cyanotype process. In this instance, I actually moved the tulips a few times during the first traditional exposure, so you can see those sort of ghostly tulips in the background, and the more vibrant tulips where I didn't move them in the foreground. And then after that, with the wet cyanotype, with just soap suds and vinegar on this one. But you can get some very sort of magical effects with it. It really is quite an exciting process to watch as well. And just another example made in the same way. That's produced some really nice sort of golden tones in it, and I think that's just from the vinegar and the soap sud combination. But as I say, it's different every time. Every image is completely unique. No two are ever the same. Again, bleaching. So this one was a traditional cyanotype that was bleached, and then I wasn't really very happy with the first one, so I bleached it, coated it again with cyanotype chemicals, and then put it outside again and exposed it again. So basically, you end up with this sort of layering effect. So the orange comes from the bleaching process, and then obviously the blue from the second coating with the cyanotype chemicals. And more of the same. It was a leaf image that had just a plain blue and white leaf silhouette that I wasn't very happy with, so I bleached it, recoated it with cyanotype chemicals, and then used lots of plants on top. So basically, where the brighter blue and white is in the center of the image, that was white originally, and everything else behind it was created during a multiple exposure on top of it, to create that sort of layered effects. And again, I mean, it's quite a busy image that, and it's hard to make out the actual silhouette of the leaf, but it does show the difference that you can make by just experimenting a little bit with bleaching things and moving things around. So another lovely picture of myself, which I hate. But this, just to say that you don't have to print on paper, you can print on fabric. I created this apron. It's basically hellebore leaves from my garden and some soap suds and some vinegar. I would say that soap suds don't work very well on fabric because they soak in and you lose the definition of them, but it does create some quite interesting effects. But with regard to printing on fabric, personally, I wouldn't wear anything that's printed with cyanotype close to the skin. I've seen images of people, and there's a lot of around at the minute of images that people have made of face masks with cyanotype images on the front of them, and they look lovely. But I've read that the skin can absorb the chemicals of the cyanotype. Now, I'm not a scientist and I have no idea whether this is correct or not, but I would be very wary of actually wearing a cyanotype garment against the skin. The other problem with it is that it can bleach during washing, so you've got to be really careful about washing it using washing liquid or whatever without any phosphates in it, because that will bleach your cyanotype print. It really doesn't matter about my apron. I just use it when I'm mixing the chemicals and splashing the soap suds about to protect my clothes. And if I wash it and it bleaches, I'll just do it again. It really doesn't matter, but I certainly wouldn't sell it to anybody. And as I say, I wouldn't wear anything against my skin. But they are good for things like wall hangings. You can make nice bags out of them, cushions. But yeah, it's something you can do, but it's not something that I've experimented with too much personally. You can also create cyanotypes on glass, stone, wood. I've seen people do it on eggshells. As I said before, it's such an interesting process, and there's so many different things that you can do with it that it's just worth it. And I would definitely recommend having a look on, if you're on Facebook. There's a great group called Cyanotype. There's a group called World Cyanotype Day and another one called Alternative Photographic Processes. And there's some real inspiration in those groups with brilliant images being created by people all over the world, and you get lots of inspiration and ideas from other people. It's really worth looking at what other people do and checking it out. I'm getting near the end now because you're probably all bored rigid. Just finish up with a bit of information about a project I've been working on over the past year. At Burton Agnes Hall in East Yorkshire. I've been working there for the past year in their beautiful wall garden here, using the plants from the garden to make cyanotype prints with. And the idea was that an exhibition would take place actually in that beautiful house in the background there, in one of the rooms, of all the images that I'd created, which was supposed to start on the 1st of May. And sadly, obviously, that's been postponed for the time being, but hopefully it will go ahead at some point in the future. So fingers crossed. So that's me enjoying myself in their beautiful wall garden, picking some of the fantastic plants. Alliums, of course, being another one of my favourites. This is an example of a print that I made from a tree peony leaf that I collected at Burton Agnes Hall. I just thought I'd show you this one because some leaves do contain tannins, and tannins can be used to tone cyanotypes. Now, this one was actually a second exposure using this leaf. I'd previously created an image where a little bit of those browny purpley tones had come through, but not much. But the leaf was still intact, so I just used it to create another image. And I think because it had previously been soaked, some of the tannins were released into this second print, and it gives some really nice definition and some different colouring to the leaves. So you just never really know what you are going to get with a wet cyanotype, and just expect the unexpected, really. Another one of my favourite plants to use is snowdrops. I mean, I just love snowdrops anyway because it's the harbinger of spring, if you like, and they're just such beautiful little creatures. And an example of a print that I've created for Burton Agnes Hall exhibition using snowdrops collected from their woodland, which was what was displayed in the previous image. And I have made an awful lot of work as a result of this project because I've been doing it for a year, trying to capture the essence of the gardens and the woodlands through the seasons. And this is just a small collection of some of the prints that I've created, and you can see there the variations in the tones and the colours. There's obviously some traditional cyanotypes thrown in there as well, but it just gives you an idea of the range of different colours and textures and backgrounds that you can get from this really magical and exciting process. And hopefully, if this exhibition goes ahead at some point in the future, some of you will be able to come along and see it in person. And we just keep our fingers crossed that will happen. I've also worked on a smaller project with the Yorkshire Arboretum at Castle Howard as well, and I've been collecting leaves from their grounds, leaves of trees mainly, and created a series of cyanotype prints and wet cyanotype prints there too. I was scheduled to be holding an exhibition of those in August. At the moment, I'm not sure whether that will go ahead or not, so that's possibly something that might happen in the future. But as I say, hopefully some of you will be able to come along and see my work in person at some point. And my work is available for sale as well from my Etsy website. Anyway, thank you everybody for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope that you might have
into it. And then moving into the wet processing is truly inspiring and inspirational, and a joy to watch. So we've had as I thought, we've had a couple of questions which we'll go to. But just before we get to that, just some of the lovely comments that we've had. We've had stay as long as you like. This is fascinating.
Thanks, Chris.
Wow, they're beautiful. So we've had absolutely loads of just brilliant sort of comments sort of coming through. So that's absolutely lovely. I think naturally through the lovely talk that you gave us, you may have answered some of these questions, but we will just go over them just to sort of clarify. So I think one of the first questions that we had in was, how long can you store the dried paper once it's been coated?
You can store it for quite a long time. As I mentioned, you can actually buy packs of the pre-coated paper, and they do have an expiry date on them, which I'm not sure how long that is. I think it's about a year. Personally, I haven't never kept it that long because I'm too impatient. But
right.
I've definitely kept it for a few weeks. I mean, I think the very first time I tried the process, I actually went on a workshop, and it was in November, so it wasn't the sunniest time of year. And when we left the workshop, we left with a few sheets of paper to bring home with us to try at home. And I think we didn't have any sun for weeks, and I ended up keeping them for about 6 months before I used them again. And they do work fine. You've got to keep them in a light-proof bag, and you've got to keep them in the dark. And ideally, you've got to keep them somewhere where it's not very humid, because if they're exposed to humidity, they do start to cloud. But
right.
For a traditional blue and white cyanotype, they do still work, but you've got to rinse them a lot longer. And for wet cyanotypes, it really doesn't matter, because it just adds another element into the process.
Okay, so I think ultimately there as well, if you do get into cyanotypes, I don't think the issue would be for how long they'd last, because you'd get through them anyway.
Yeah, that's the problem. You need more paper than you've actually got room to store.
Yeah, that's it. We had a question about, is it possible to overexpose? And once again, I think this was answered naturally anyway. It just is what it is, really, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, if you're doing a traditional cyanotype, then yes, it is possible to overexpose, especially if you're using things like flowers, because the sun goes through the petals quite quickly, and you can almost end up with a plain blue sheet of paper if you leave them for too long. And the same with photographic negatives as well. If you expose them for too long, then you can definitely overexpose those. With wet cyanotype, it's not such an issue, because the exposures are very long anyway. But again, with things like flowers, sometimes you can expose through the petals and lose the details of the flowers. So yeah, you do have to be a bit careful. If I've got petals on a page, then I tend to only expose for a couple of hours at the most.
Okay. And it's essentially just a trial and error at that particular point, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that I didn't mention is I do have failures. I mean, I do have a fairly good hit rate. A lot of them do come out and they're fine from the start. But as I mentioned in the talk, you can bleach them and recoat with chemicals and expose them again. So nothing's lost. If you get a print you don't like it, just stick it in a tray of water with some bleach and some water, and it goes like an orangey colour, and then you can recoat and re-expose, and you've got another layer.
Recoat and reuse.
Yeah.
Well, brilliant. Well, there we go. That's lovely. Once again, I think we went over paper, but it's what particular paper do you use? Once again, it's really just something that's going to last that rinse process, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I use a paper called Hahnemuhle Platinum Rag paper almost exclusively now. That is, it's quite expensive to buy, and I certainly wouldn't recommend starting off with it when you first try. I would just buy some watercolor paper from the art shop or something. I mean, I've seen people have done cyanotype prints on old book pages and musical music scripts, and people use all sorts. The only thing to bear in mind with paper is that most paper has been treated, it's buffered, and that means it's got alkaline content, and over a length of time, over a number of years, that can make your cyanotype fade. The advantage of using the Hahnemuhle Platinum Rag is that it's unbuffered paper, so it doesn't have that element to it. So theoretically, the images will last for a lot longer. But having said that, as I mentioned earlier, the cyanotypes of Anna Atkins have been around since 1843. And although they're stored in the dark and only brought out when people ask to see them, or if they're on exhibition, they have lasted the test of time. So
yeah, oh, that's brilliant. I don't think we're going to have time to get through all of these questions, so I'll just pick a couple more. There's a question about toning, which I think you did quite well just on there. We had one about does the vegetation sweating under the glass have any adverse effects?
No, I mean, I actually posted a picture on my Instagram feed yesterday of a print that I had outside. It was really hot here yesterday, and there was a lot of condensation under the glass as a result of that. And all that does really is add some extra moisture into the wet cyanotype process. What I would say is if you're doing a traditional cyanotype and you get condensation under the glass, if that water does touch the paper, then it will affect the final print. But if you've dried and pressed your plant beforehand, then that doesn't normally happen. It's only if you're using your plants fresh.
That's brilliant. And I think we'll just do one more. We've had a couple of questions about, just let me try and find one of them, about the bleach that you use, whether it's photographic bleach or is it just sort of normal bleach that you use? Oh, there it is. Is there a certain bleach that you use before the toning, is it?
Yeah, Domestos.
Okay.
Basically household bleach.
Just household bleach.
Yeah, I think off the top of my head, the ratio is something like 50 milliliters of bleach to a litre of water. You can also use the washing soda crystals, which I think is about 8 grams of washing soda crystals to a litre of water. That will give you quite a gentle bleach, because if you can actually bleach it back to a paler blue. So if you've overexposed something, if you put it in a gentle mix and just bleach it gently, you can get it back to something that you actually like. But if you leave it for a longer time, then it goes to the orangey tones. If you just want to zap it and make it orange, then increase the amount of bleach or washing soda. The only other thing I would say that I didn't mention is that there is a very good book called Cyanotype historical and alternative photography by a guy called Peter Murha. I'm not sure how I'm saying that correctly. But that is my go-to book if I need some information on a more technical aspect of traditional cyanotypes. And he's got some really good information in that book about bleaching and toning. So if that's the kind of thing you're interested in, I would definitely recommend investing in that book.
Brilliant. That's absolutely fantastic. And we'll post some links in the comments below to the references that we've used today as well, including a sort of link to where you can get the Platinum Rag Harmer Muller from, because I believe we can actually get it for you as well. So that's absolutely brilliant. Pardon me for a minute. Losing my voice. Jill, thank you ever much for joining us today and sharing your work with us and your work process. It's been wonderful to watch. We've had loads of amazing comments. So thank you ever much for joining us. And everyone, please let us know how much you've enjoyed it in the comments as well. So thank you very much for now, Jill. I'll just put you back into the green room and I'll speak to you after the live. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Oh, brilliant talk there from Jill. It's always lovely to see her and sharing her work as well, which is really, really nice. So yes, great kickoff for today. Absolutely wonderful from Jill there. Later on today, we have got a talk coming from Justin Carr, who will be doing a talk on his digiscoping, so with I believe his Swarovski scope. So very much looking forward to that. Once again, another alternative process on photography, so not just using a long lens to actually photograph, but using possibly an existing scope that you might have yourself and learning how to convert that into taking pictures through it as well. So very much looking forward to that. Thank you very much for joining in live. If you've joined in live, thank you very much for the comments. It's always appreciated. If you're rewatching this, you can still comment in our videos. If there's still any questions that you've got, post them in there and we'll try and get to them. Like the video, share the video. If you're watching on our YouTube page, make sure you subscribe to us and you will get notifications on when we are going live with our next talks. From me for now, until later on today, we'll see you then. Bye-bye for now.